Hello, everyone, and welcome to this month, November's live discussion. My name is Dr. Benjamin Park. I'm a historian of American religion and politics with a specialty on Mormonism. I'm the author or editor of 5 books, 4 of which you can see over my shoulder here, most notably being the one American Zion, A New History of Mormonism, which I'm very pleased to share won a couple awards in the last few weeks. So that's the first update of the month. That won the Phyllis Schaff Award for best book in the history of Christianity from the American Society of Church History, which is an absolutely wonderful honor. And just this week, I was alerted that the book was the finalist for best book in Utah history by the Utah Historical Society, which is, again, a wonderful, wonderful honor. Now, my goal with this YouTube channel is I hope that this channel can provide some uplifting discussions or a more rigorous discourse, especially on topics like religion and politics that have become so fraught, especially now that so many people are getting their news and their information from YouTube. I think it's important for historians to find ways to reach out to where people are, which is what I'm trying to do with this channel. Every Monday, I do deep dives on a particular historical topic. On Wednesdays, I connect the past to the present. And then on Fridays, I do a deep dive on a historical topic that allows us to pull back the curtains and understand how history is done. I either talk about a particular historical issue and I introduce you to some of the key documents and provide links for those, and we do a deep dive and read between those lines, or I talk about a new book or an influential article. And just this month, I started doing interviews with scholars, which I'll get to in a bit. And then the first Wednesday of every month, I want to do these live discussions where it's a chance for you to ask me questions and I can keep touch with the community and know what's on your mind. I'm also trying out on different times for this live. Before I was doing it in the afternoon. Now I'm doing it in the evening. We will see what works best, but please feel free to let me know if there's a time that you think works best for these types of conversations. And please remember to subscribe to the channel. That's the best way to make sure you don't miss out on any of these geeky, nerdy deep dives. And if you want to give back enable both me and my wonderful producer, Anthony Ambrose, to continue this effort, you can consider becoming a member. Now, I want to provide a brief overview of some of the videos I've done in the last month in case you've missed any, to at least whet your appetite to go back and watch those on your own. The big theme from the month was the LDS hierarchy, in part due to the change at the LDS First Presidency level. Russell M. Nelson passed away in September. Dallin H. eventually became the president, although it was the longest apostolic interregnum in over a century. And then he reorganized the First Presidency, and that gave us a chance to reflect back on how the LDS hierarchy is structured, how it's evolved over the time. So I have a few questions in advance that I'll be digging into, but please feel free to ask those questions. But I did videos on Russell M. Nelson and his presidency, what he will be known for. I think from a historical perspective, at least initial takes, because it'll take a while for us to truly understand what the significance was of the last 8 years. I did a video on Dallin H. that I was pretty proud of, because I introduced you to some of the key documents and moments from Dallin H. Oakes's life that I think should give us some insight into what we can look going forward. And I provided a lot of links and background so that you might be able to read up on the past that was probably going to frame the present, though does not determine it. I also did a video on the last time that there was a dispute among the LDS authority and the hierarchy, which was the succession period between 1887 and 1889, the last time that there was infighting over who should succeed, and establishing the precedent of the senior member of the Quorum of the 12 immediately ascending to the First Presidency. So go back and watch that. And I also did a whole video on the number of counselors who have shaped the church in the past, and talking about Sidney Rigdon, George Q. Cannon, J. Reuben Clark, N. Eldon Tanner, and Gordon B. Hinckley, and why that position of the first counselor is so influential in the LDS hierarchy. And so that's why the choice of D. Todd Christofferson, perhaps a surprise choice for the second counselor, might be quite influential going forward. I also had videos on ideas and concepts that came from LDS hierarchy but evolved over the time. I did a video on the white horse prophecy. I did a video on the desire to find an 1831 revelation from Joseph Smith on polygamy and why that solves some knots for LDS authorities. I talked about the Adam God theory and Brigham Young's teaching that was embedded in LDS curriculum and even the temple before it fell by the wayside. I talked about the LDS leaders' teachings on Columbus and how that showed the signs of the time. And then I also talked about the decline of the Moroni image and the Mormon exceptional status within the LDS tradition and the rise of an emphasis on commonalities with broader Christianity. This last month, I also introduced a new way to do my Friday videos, which was interviews with a number of scholars. I talked with Jonathan Stapley about his new book on the evolution of LDS temple worship. And I also talked to Matt Harris about his new article on white Christian nationalism, something that I've been getting some good feedback from people. So I think I will keep those interviews going forward. In fact, looking forward to the month of November, I have 3 interviews lined up for several of the next few Fridays, or at least this Friday. I have interviewed Elise Boxer, a scholar at the University of South Dakota, who has a brand new book out on Mormon settler colonialism that looks at how Mormonism interacted with Native Americans. It's a phenomenal new book that I strongly recommend, and you'll learn more about that on Friday. In a couple of weeks, I have Max Mueller on to talk about his new biography of Wakara, a phenomenally important, if often overlooked figure in Utah history and his intersections with Mormonism. And then at the beginning of December, I have an interview with Matt Bowman and his co-author about their new book on BYU basketball, which is just as riveting as you might think. It is the nexus of my nerdy obsessions, which is sports and history and religion all rolled into one that I strongly, strongly recommend. I also have individual videos coming up on the Missouri Extermination Order, on Joseph Smith's 1826 trial, on another LDS apostle who was excommunicated for sexual activities, and also a video on the first pro-LGBTQ voice to be published in a Mormon periodical. So stay tuned for all of those. I see we have a few questions coming in, but I do want to get to some advanced questions that were submitted by some of the members of the channel. Again, I'm really grateful for those who have taken the plunge and become members. That support is what enables me and my producer to spend time to research and to edit and put these videos together. And I'm very, very grateful for those of you who have become members, and you are what allows this to happen. But let me start with the first question. This is a bit of a long one, so stay with me. Should the church just admit its mistakes? Polygamy, the priesthood ban, the 2015 baptism restrictions. Thoughtful members aren't leaving because of our history, but because of the church's unwillingness to be honest about it. Nelson said dark skin is a curse, yet ignored canon that says it is. Why not fix the canon? Why not remove section 132 instead of pretending it teaches monogamy? Some say correcting these things would harm faith, but there wasn't a mass exodus when Nelson called Hinckley's Mormon campaign a major victory for Satan. Wouldn't the church be stronger if it faced reality and stopped trying to protect members from it? That's a phenomenal question. And it actually gets into an anxiety that scholars are trying to capture when it comes to modern Mormonism. How much leeway do LDS authorities have to admit prophetic fallibility without undercutting their authority in the present? I think that's the driving anxiety, that as soon as they admit mistakes in the past, it's going to raise questions of what are the mistakes of today. And I'm going to give you a few examples of that. But I think to tie into this month's theme of the new present, Dallin H gave the statement that I think summarizes this anxiety perfectly when he said that the word apology does not appear in scripture. This idea that the church does not give apologies, nor does it seek apologies, which really captures a particular mindset that is, this forward thinking, this forward moving, that we're not dwelling on the problems of the past, in part because the problems of the past bring consequences for the present. So let me talk about one of those one of those issues that this wonderful question brought up, which is D&C 132. I think the fact that Joseph Smith's practice of polygamy was enshrined in a revelation makes it so much different than all the other teachings of Joseph Smith and Brigham Young that have since gone away. My theory is that if it wasn't for Hyrum Smith getting Joseph Smith to dictate the revelation now known as D&C 132 on July 12th of 1843, if it weren't for that text, I think many Latter-day Saints would see polygamy the same way they now see the racial restriction, which is a product of its time, but maybe the result of fallibility and does not have long-standing binding. But because it's caught in that revelatory text, because it was then added to that canon, they feel they can't excise it without undercutting the authority of all other scriptures and prophetic authority. I think I'm going to do an entire video on D&C 132 at some point, probably a series, because there's a lot to do. By the way, I will recommend that Faith Matters, the organization, is doing a 5-part series on D&C 132 this week to coincide with the LDS Church's gospel doctrine curriculum. And they have a number of podcasts and interviews with leading scholars on it, like it was Laurel Ulrich yesterday, Nate Oman today, and Carolyn Pearson later this week. Whether or not you like that brand of apologetics, I think they got on some great people that I strongly recommend that series. So I recommend going to check that out. More recently, on this notion of prophetic fallibility and apologizing or recognizing wrong, I think the November 5, 2015 policy is another important example. Now, I'm going to have a video on the November 5 policy for next Wednesday, so something to look forward to. I don't know if I say that instead of saying I'm going to do a future video on a topic. I know that's a drinking game that some of you do. What is it when I say I have a video coming forward on that next Wednesday? Is that whatever it is? Anyways, the November 5th policy, I think, tested the boundaries of LDS prophetic discourse because it was seen as so odious, as such an affront to LDS members, that's why at first they tried to double down, Russell M. Nelson calling it a revelation, something that was then walked back by the church. And then the church rescinding that policy a few years later and admitting, I think the closest the church has ever come to giving an apology or admitting fallibility from leadership, when they said we are walking back this policy because we want to lower the temperature, I think was the term that was used. And that's the first time I ever saw LDS leaders recognize that we are responding to the broader climate on something that was taken as official policy and in some contexts framed as revelation. And that showed that LDS leaders can only do so much without some pushback. And another prominent example of this, of course, is that I like the comment of the first merch this channel has is a shot glass for a drinking game. That just makes it so ironic. I enjoy that. I think the COVID era is another recent touchstone on this topic when there were so many Latter-day Saints who were aghast that church leaders urged them to wear masks and be vaccinated and practice social distancing because it conflicted with their social priorities. And I think it's notable that the church kind of quieted down on that as a result, because again, they tested the boundaries. They felt the third rail, and then they backed off as soon as because I think prophetic authority in the LDS tradition does not always work in a way that we assume, which is as soon as LDS leaders say to jump, members ask how high and they do it. Instead, LDS leaders operate within a realm of social capital to where there's enough leeway that members grant them. And whenever they give directions that is outside of that socially acceptable norm, they revolt. And in the 1978 racial restriction end was an example. There were a number of Latter-day Saints who left the LDS Church as a result of the end of the racial restriction. The fundamentalist Mormon community, they took in, according to their accounts, hundreds, if not thousands, of Latter-day Saints just in the first few days. But what made the 1978 racial restrictions end so smooth, just in general, was that the general Latter-day Saint body had gotten to a place where they were expecting something like that. And so I think that that's an important example. All right. One more advanced question, and then hopefully some of you can come up with some questions. I see a few coming in here. that I'm glad to see. All right, another question. DNC 110 was never verified by Joseph Smith or Cowdery. It was written in the third person by a scribe on the last page of Joseph Smith's journal, never mentioned elsewhere, canonized by Orson Pratt in 1876 without proof, yet it is the foundation of LDS sealing power. Why don't historians and critics talk about more? I love this topic. Thank you so much for bringing it up. And this actually, I want to do a video at some point in the future, I want to do a video at some point in the future talking about how Orson Pratt's 1876 edition of the Doctrine and Covenants is so influential, yet overlooked in structuring how we as Latter-day Saints approach Scripture. In part because he is taking all these documents. He was a church historian at the time, and he's just discovering these documents in the records and like, hey, this looks good. Let's throw it into the canon. I think the best example of this is what's actually DNC 130 and 131, which were reports of Joseph Smith delivering a sermon outside of Nauvoo around 1842 or 43. I'm forgetting the exact year. And Joseph Smith speaks for like a couple hours, and someone, Willard Richards or some of the other scribes, jot down basically a summary. Like, it's a 2-hour sermon. They jot down 12 lines, and those lines go into the church's records. And then 30 years later, Oliver Cowdery takes those and like, hey, more teachings by Joseph Smith that confirm these doctrines that have become central. Let's insert them into the Doctrine and Covenants. And it causes, and it's then accepted as Scripture. So now you read it and you're like, you almost assume that Joseph Smith just dictated that and they write it down like he did with the earlier revelations, when in reality, this is like a third-hand account that was not jotted down to be presented as a revelation, but was just notes on a sermon. Imagine you going to an address, a speech, and you just summarize 10 of the key points you heard from an hour-long oration. And then 30 years later, someone takes your notes and presents it as the word of whoever you are hearing. That's what DNC 130 and 131 basically are. So now to go to the specific question of DNC 110. Now, for those of you who may not have these revelations on the tip of your mind, DNC 110 is when Joseph Smith and Oliver Cowdery claim to be visited by Jesus Christ, Moses, Elias, and Elijah. I will note Elijah and Elias being separate individuals is a Mormon thing that lots of critics and scholars have kind of dissected. Why does Joseph Smith separate into two people, what seems to actually be one person in the Bible? And what does that tell us about LDS Scripture? So first of all, I think, and I don't think this question is inferring this, but I do want to make it clear, this record does seem to be contemporaneous. Maybe not the same day that Joseph Smith claimed to have that visitation, but within a few days. We know this because it's in the handwriting of Warren Cowdery, who apostatizes shortly afterwards. So there's only a small time period in which Warren Cowdery is serving as a scribe for Joseph Smith's journal, and so it had to come during that time. And further, Oliver Cowdery writes in a letter referencing this visitation within a couple of weeks. So we know the document comes from there. But what's interesting is that that first account, the rough draft in Warren Cowdery's hand, with as the question rightly notes, was in the third person, right? It's Warren Cowdery relating what had been told to him. We don't know if that's actually based on an earlier document or if this is the earliest document. Now, Warren Cowdery had actually had a practice like other scribes to where they would create a rough draft of something and then later copy a fair copy into the diary. So maybe that's the case here. Maybe this is the earliest copy. But then years later, in 1843, Willard Richards, who is now the church historian by that point, takes that account and changes it into the first person. Now, that does happen while Joseph Smith is alive. We don't know how much oversight Joseph Smith had. I apologize for the sweating. It's in my veins. And I get really excited about nerdy stuff if you haven't noticed. I think that Willard Richards changes it into the first person. Whether Joseph Smith had a hand in that or not, it's just speculation. But that's the account that then gets added by Orson Pratt later on. So what lessons can we take from this is that these texts that we have in the Doctrine and Covenants, especially these later texts, are of a fundamentally different type of document than the earliest earlier revelations in the Doctrine and Covenants, which probably for believers, it's going to raise questions of what gets counted as scripture and whatnot. And for scholars, it gets into this question of how scripture is made and how it's canonized, which I find remarkably fascinating. So that's just touching on a few of the answers to the wonderful question. But again, I think I'm going to do an entire video on that at some point in the future. All right. Sorry for taking so long on some questions in advance. So let me go. Oh my goodness, I've there's been a lot of questions. I really apologize for this. Are you going to make a video about the Snuffer movement? I used to be a part of it since the beginning and it could be an interesting topic. That is such a fascinating. Thank you for sharing. First of all, maybe I'll need to interview you to get more insights. That I will jot that down as a potential topic. I only know about this. I'm far from an expert on the Snuffer movement. All I know is what's been reported in various news outlets. I listened to Denver Snuffer's long interview with the Mormon Land podcast to kind of get his perspective. And then when I was writing my book, American Zion, which you see right there, I dug in at least a little bit and used the Snuffer movement as an example of the current anxiety on the Mormon right that the LDS Church has become too bureaucratized. It's lost its spiritual charisma. It needs a renewal. And then also the Snuffer movement is interesting in the context of the growing skepticism of Joseph Smith practicing the polygamy, given that Denver Snuffer himself has denied that Joseph Smith practiced polygamy because in his mind, Brigham Young introduced it, which fits into this broader declension narrative of the entire Snufferite argument, which is a declension narrative means that there is, this golden age that has since kind of dissipated and lost. And that's argument by Denver Snuffer and others, that Joseph Smith had the pure gospel. It was corrupted by Brigham Young. It's been corrupting ever since, and it's time then to restore it. So yeah, I will do a video in the future. I'll need to do a bit more digging. What is the LDS Church's explanation for the Book of Abraham mistranslation of the papyri? Does its explanation hold water, or where are its weaknesses? That's a great question. And I have had the Book of Abraham on my list of videos to do, and I'll eventually do it. So for those who don't know, Joseph Smith gets in possession a mummy and some papyri scroll in Kirtland in 1835-36. He claims to translate the papyri first into the Book of Abraham, and then he claims the other papyri is a book of, I forget the other text. He translates the Book of Abraham, although importantly, and I make this distinction in my Kingdom of Nauvoo book, I think we assume a lot of people assume that all of what we have as the Book of Abraham comes from that period in 1835-36 when Joseph Smith is having a Hebrew school and he feels like he's using his new linguistic skills to translate. But we actually only have the first chapter of the Book of Abraham and the first 18 verses of the second chapter. I apologize if I'm flubbing a couple of the specifics, but I'm going off of memory here, so be forgiving. But everything we have from like chapter 2, verse 18 on, I argue is actually a creation in Nauvoo in 1842, because I see that as a key part of what I called in Kingdom of Nauvoo, Joseph Smith's Abraham Project, where much of that language and arguments is actually a reflection of his political and religious and theological anxieties during those Nauvoo years. So now, sorry, I got off on a tangent. Let me pull myself back onto the question. What are the LDS apologetics? Because in 1967, the Chicago Museum, or sorry, I think it's the New York Museum, they gotten from the Chicago Museum, that they found the papyri that the Chicago Museum had assumed had been destroyed, that had assumed were destroyed in the Great Chicago Fire in the 1890s. And so it's like, oh my goodness, we have these texts that are the foundations of the Book of Abraham, but then it turns out they don't match what's in they don't match what's in the actual text, right? So the papyri scrolls that we know come from what Joseph Smith had, the text on them, it's actually more funerary text. It does not match what Joseph Smith claims is the Book of Abraham. How does the LDS Church respond? Well, there's been two primary apologetic arguments. One is the lost scroll theory. They claim that there are portions of the scrolls that were destroyed in the fire or were lost, and what were preserved are not the portions from which Joseph Smith translated the Book of Abraham. That's one argument. I don't think it really holds much water because we have plenty of documents from the time that kind of talk about the images on the text and the length, and it seems most arguments show that what we have for those scrolls are what Joseph Smith had. The second apologetic argument, which is taking a lot more becoming a lot more popular in LDS circles, especially like the intellectual LDS circles, is what's called the springboard theory. That what Joseph Smith produced was not a literal translation of these funeral texts, but rather the funeral text prompted Joseph Smith to produce these texts that are coming from God rather than the scrolls. And they use as an example that the Book of Mormon is like that because Joseph Smith isn't looking directly at the plates, he's looking at a seer stone. They're saying, like with the Bible, it's not like Joseph Smith is looking at the ancient manuscripts of the Bible when he provides a Joseph Smith translation of the Bible. He's just looking at the contemporary Bible and saying, Revelation is telling me what's different. And that projection theory has gained a lot more credence. I think it's important that when the LDS Church put out its gospel topics essay, that they stated they provided both theories as possibilities, and that's where it's at. I, as a scholar, I will say that I can see how either of those work within a believer's perspective, but I'll just say that I don't think external scholars will, recognize the validity of especially the lost scroll theory, and the projection theory is based more in faith rather than what actually took place. I want to really thank I think the name is Test, who left a quote, or a note, or sorry, a tip. That's the word. So thank you so much. And then also got a tip from Aaron, who asked, to what degree was McConkie's Mormon doctrine considered doctrinal, if not at least a supplemental summary of LDS teaching? That's a great question. And again, I know all of you are going to get drunk from this drinking game. I'm going to do a video at some point in the future on Bruce R. McConkie's Mormon doctrine, which was like scripture on my LDS mission. I don't know what it was like on yours. But I think what's notable is that from the very point that Mormon doctrine was published in the 1950s, there were Latter-day Saint leaders who did not recognize it as correct, not just scripture, but incorrect. And there was a committee formed to find the flaws in the book. And I forget the exact number, but it's something like they found flaws and they found like 1,300 some odd flaws. I mean, it was an astronomical number. And their decision, this apostolic committee that looked at it, said, I think these are too many flaws to correct, so we should just not publish it again. And so Bruce R. McConkie was told to stand down, and that's why first editions are so rare. And then over a decade later, Bruce R. McConkie gets permission to publish a second edition. With the bit of subversion going on, there's some debates about how much David O. McKay was actually lucid and how much he actually gave his approval. But I think the question is, I think Mormon doctrine was considered controversial from the very beginning, but it was seen as an authoritative type of commentary that contained clues. I on my mission, I already mentioned it was accepted by scripture by a lot, but there are many others who recognize the flaws. I had a companion who referred to Mormon doctrine as Big Bruce's book of his opinions. So I think it was always recognized as being problematic. Now, I now see I missed a question from Test. If you were called as President Oakes's new apostle and eventually became prophet, what would you do to change or reform the church? That would be a horrible choice on the part of Dallin H. Oakes, and I think he's wise enough to avoid a pitfall like that. But I like the suggestion, that's way above my pay grade. I mean, number one, obviously, I'd introduce beards as an acceptable form of presentability, especially at BYU. And I will note, I think there should be some hope from BYU students. They should at least start a petition for Dallin H. Oakes to allow beards on campus, because Dallin H. Oakes, when he was president of BYU, gave an address directly talking about the beard ban and saying that the reason why we do this is cultural circumstance. It's not doctrine. And there will come a day when beards are no longer associated with hippie and anti-institutional status. And at that point, we'll allow beards at BYU. And so now I think BYU students, and I don't know if any BYU students are on this Zoom call now, I think BYU students should start putting a petition saying, hey, we got a vice president who has a beard. Beards are now acceptable in the, business boardrooms, which of course is always an important example for LDS leadership. Maybe we should accept well-groomed beards as part of, LDS culture. So I just want to get the ball rolling on that. And then other changes. I don't want to get into a lot of the points, but I will say I grant more leeway to the church history department to publish a lot of great stuff and open up access. Oh, and here's an answer I'll give. I would give scholars access to the millions of pages of survey data that the LDS Church has. Gathered over the last century. So those are a few changes. And of course, I'd like the church to be less homophobic and other things like that too. All right, more questions. What is the current state of eternal polygamy? Men can be sealed to more than one woman, but not vice versa. Do you see that ever changing, either to be more expansive or restrictive? I'll note that as of a few years ago, they have reversed that policy in which women could only be sealed to one man. From what I've seen, they now allow women to be sealed to multiple men when there's a dispute, like their husband dies and they're sealed to their husband, and then they marry a new man and they allow her to get sealed to the second man. And the philosophy is, well, it'll all be sorted in the eternity. I think that's at least one concession. But I don't think the ghost of eternal polygamy is going away anytime soon, because we have the second prophet in a row who is an eternal polygamist, right? Russell M. Nelson and Dallin H. both had a spouse in this life who died, then were sealed to, or married and sealed to a second spouse, both of whom are sealed to each other in the eternities. And Dallin H. is not only aware of this, but he takes this into consideration. We have from his the biography that was published by the wonderful historian Richard Turley, who had access to all of Dallin H. Oakes's diaries. Apparently, Dallin H. Oakes's diaries is as voluminous and incisive as George Hugh Cannon's, which is also a phenomenal source base like Wilford Woodruff's. And apparently in the diaries, it includes that when Dallin H. was courting his current wife after his first wife died, he had a discussion with her saying, are you okay joining as a second wife in the eternities? And so that shows that that's something that they have in their mind. And so I think because they're bound to this theological principle that's sacralized and canonized in scripture, you can't get around it. But I think Latter-day Saints will become a bit more expansive, or at least provide more liberality in it, like in now allowing women to be sealed to more than one husband. Now, Nathan Oman, who was actually on the Faith Matters podcast about DNC 132 today, he's actually made the case in an article that he published last year or the year before, that liberal definition of sealing, in which we're just creating a cosmic web that's going to survive death, but maybe not all the details are worked out, might actually provide a framework for same-sex sealings, especially when connected to the practice of adoptions back in the day. So I think those are a few examples. All right. I got another. Thank you so much for the tip from Test again. Congrats for 10K subs. Apparently we got there. If we did, someone give me a confirmation. Maybe Anthony send me a message if we did get to 10K subs. So thank you so much. I think we were about 45 or so short when we started, but thank you so much, Test, for your support that allows us to continue on. Camilla asks, hi, Professor Park. Is it necessary to read the Bible to understand Mormon history? A member told me that trying to grasp Mormonism without it is like attempting calculus without basic algebra. Now, I should frame my question. I should provide a caveat that I do not know the difference between calculus and algebra. The last math class that I did well in was titled math. Um, a bit of a exaggeration. But so I recognize, I get the analogy, but I do want to admit my weaknesses here. Yes. So the question of can you understand Latter day Saints without the Bible is no. The Latter day Saint culture in the early church was steeped in the Bible. It's important to remember that Joseph Smith's primary job for the first 3 years of of leading the church was translating the Bible. That every day he was reading through texts in the Bible. And that then bleeds into his revelations and his practices. That because the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter day Saints believe that they are just the latest iteration of a tradition that goes back to the Bible, and that Joseph Smith was just a modern day Moses, it meant that they are taking types and patterns out of the Bible and trying to mimic them in this life. Their discourses are steeped in biblical references. Their pamphlets often reference the Bible. In fact, when they would reference scripture, they were far more likely to reference the Bible than they were to referencing the Book of Mormon. Now, there are some arguments for why that is, but in general, it's because they lived in an era in which the Bible was taken for granted. All right, I know I'm falling behind on questions, so I apologize. So let me go to some more. So excited for a video of Orson Pratt and his impact. Me too. All right, what do you make from Nathan? What do you make sorry, that just disappeared again. What do you make of Mormon culture's apparent affinity for sci-fi fantasy, Lord of the Rings, Star Wars, Harry Potter, etc.? Anything to that, or simply a reflection of broader US culture? I would take it a step further. Not only do Mormons love sci-fi and fantasy, they produce sci-fi and fantasy, from the Twilight series, Stephanie Meyer, to Brandon Sanderson and his Mistborn series. And in fact, there was an essay that I think was a bit overstated and was properly ridiculed, titled something like "Brandon Sanderson is Your God Now," which recognized that Mormons are framing a lot of sci-fi and fantasy in today. Now, why that is, that's outside of my field of expertise, but I will point to what some other scholars have said. Now, I'm really excited. In a few weeks, I'm going to be at the American Academy of Religion. I'm the co-chair of the Mormon Studies Unit for the American Academy of Religion, which is the largest international society investigating religion in all its forms. And we're having a paper from Liz Busby, who's a wonderful scholar who's on the podcast I forgot the exact name, but it's like popcorn popping on the apricot tree, that old primary rhyme. I think her podcast title has something like that. And she's giving a paper on LDS sci-fi fantasy production. And I'm really excited to hear more about that. Now, what I've heard in the past is that, first of all, Latter-day Saints are interested in the cosmos. They have theories of Kolob and the order of the stars, and God and angels and men being, in the words of Parley Pratt, one great species spread across the many universes. And so I think that opens up the possibility. I think also, as Jana Reese has argued in her analysis on like Steph Meyer and Mormon culture, is that Mormons also like to take these fundamental family things and take them, put them on a cosmic level and see how they operate in different contexts, because it's a way to work out some key tensions at the heart of the Mormon tradition. And so I think those are at least two reasons why Mormons are fascinated with the cosmos. And two, we want to see how much of these family dynamics can transcend our intimate details to show that the family is eternal in these various other contexts. All right, from worldview connections, do you see data on how President Oaks's comments about sexual and gender minorities has affected younger members of the Mormon Church? They have often stirred controversy. I'm not sure what exactly you're referring to, but I will take the opportunity to riff a bit on Dallin H. Oaks's teachings on LGBTQ issues, and especially the youth, because you see an evolution in Oaks's perspectives that I think is important to keep in mind. Dallin H. Oaks, when he was BYU president, he approved research into how to cure homosexuality. He approved a research institute whose one of their theories was that homosexuality was a character flaw, a dysfunction maybe as a result of undue influence or abuse and assault. This is where the BYU studies on electric shock therapy on homosexualities come from, which, again, I might do a video on it at some point. I touched on it a little bit in my Dallin H Oaks video. But I think you've seen with Dallin H Oaks a change, because by the 2000s, he starts shifting his perspective on the origins and anxiety over homosexuality, admitting that it has inborn traits, that rather that it is nature, not just nurture. And in fact, he gives an important interview in 2007, so the year before the Prop 8 crisis in 2008 in California. Dallin H. Oaks does an interview alongside Elder Matthew Wickman, I think is the apostle's name, another lawyer. And they confess that we don't think that this is just all nature. We don't think it's forced on someone that can be cured. It could have inborn status. But, and there's the big but, we think the sin is not in having homosexual inclinations, it's acting on those homosexual inclinations. And so we need to find ways to dispel people from acting on it, which has led the church into this very awkward position now, in which they recognize and they acknowledge that homosexuality is an inborn trait, but they're not granting people to act on those inclinations. Now, it's possible that in the future, historians will look back as this just an awkward interlude from repression toward eventually acceptance, and maybe the church will stay in this position for a long time. But I think Oakes's worry of influence, especially homosexuality in the youth, is now no longer that society is going to turn people gay, but it's that society is going to give you the approval necessary to act on those queer inclinations. And I think that's a subtle but a significant shift, and it recognizes where we are now. All right, Cameron Day, what do you think are likely changes to church policy or leadership philosophy in the Oaks administration and or beyond? I'm so glad you asked this question, because I was prepared to talk about it, because this was another question that was asked on one of my other platforms in advance. First of all, I want to emphasize historians make horrible prophets. I could say something and be completely wrong. I and many others were completely wrong on Russell M. Nelson, thinking that he was not going to be a major consequential leader with massive changes. And guess what? He was the opposite of that. He introduced a number of major changes that are going to be seen as consequential going forward. With that caveat said, and now emphasizing that I could be completely wrong here, I don't see many changes in an Oaks presidency. But I do see some change in terms of policies and teachings, but I do see some changes in demeanor. And this is what I mean. First of all, I don't see him making major policy changes for three reasons. One, he's elderly at 93, which was the same age as Russell Nelson when he took charge. But Oaks is in a much weaker physical shape than Russell M. Nelson was when he was 93. And I think that that means that he might not have the energy or the push, the desire to reform. Second, I think Oaks sees himself more as a stabilizing administrator than a reformer. So I think he is anxious to kind of solidify and provide stability in the tradition rather than bring in these revolutionary change. I don't see him as saying, like Russell M. Nelson did, take your vitamin pills because a lot of changes are coming. That's just not how he works. I love the analogy that several have said that Russell M. Nelson acted like a surgeon. He would see the problem, he would dig in, and he would change it almost unilaterally as the individual who is holding the scalpel. And Dallin H. Oaks is more of the lawyer. He is working as part of a legal team. He is trying to build consensus. And so I think that typically means that there's not going to be any radical changes. And then finally, my third point of why I don't expect any radical changes is that Latter-day Saints already live in the church that Dallin H. Oaks have helped build. He has been one of the most influential apostles in the last 41 years since he was ordained, meaning that that a lot of the changes that he wanted introduced are already introduced. I don't know if there's anything that he's been wanting and pining for, but has not been implemented yet because he's already implemented so much. Now, I don't see those major changes. I could be wrong. Again, I want to emphasize that historians don't make great prophets. But I do see a change in demeanor and how Oakes sees himself in the role as prophet, different than Russell M. Nelson. And I think the best example of this dynamic is Oakes's opening press conference, right? That since Gordon B. Hinckley, and then with Thomas S. Monson, and then Russell M. Nelson, the press conference was a big event. They took questions, they spoke to the reporters, they riffed off of various points, they embraced the charismatic structure of prophetic authority. Dallin H. Oakes's opening conference was much different. It was shorter. It was only like 15 minutes. Maybe he was just startled by being called Dallas Oakes. I don't know. But once, they got the name right and he had short prepared remarks, his counselors had short prepared remarks, and then they closed without any questions. So I think Dallin H. Oakes, it's much more like a legal brief than it was, an opening press conference. Also note his slow and deliberate process of reorganizing the First Presidency. Now, there's no way to prove this. This is just speculation, so I want to preface this with that. But I have a hard time thinking that Russell M. Nelson would have waited until after General Conference to reorganize the First Presidency so that he could be sustained as president of the LDS Church. He recognized the symbolic power in that type of function. Dallin H. Oakes is more about precedent. He's more about taking a deliberate status, which is also, by the way, I think playing into the fact that we don't have a new apostle called yet, because he is taking his time. He's considering his options. So I think that's a lot different from Russell M. Nelson, who just continually pressed forward and claimed he was waking up in the middle of the night, writing down revelations in his book. And then one final example of this different demeanor is, of course, Oakes at the end of the last General Conference saying, I don't think we're going to announce any temples for a while. We've already had a lot introduced. Now we just need to complete what's already been introduced. So in general, I see Dallin H. Oakes more as an administrator than a reformer, which means I don't expect, though, again, I could be wrong, major changes in policy. But I do see a difference in demeanor and how the prophetic office is cultivated and how it's crafted. One thing that I really do hope will be a change from the Nelson to the Oakes agenda is hopefully a decrease on Mormon being a bad word. I have it on good authority from people who have had long conversations with Oakes just as recent as a few months ago, who say that when Oakes talks, it's Mormon this, Mormon that. And so maybe that'll bleed in and historians like me won't take as much heat. All right. Who do you think, from Kendra, who do you think could be the next Lester Bush? Someone whose honest scholarship could help the church confront false traditions and move toward real change? That is a wonderful question. So for those of you who might not be familiar, and then if you aren't familiar, you can go back to my video I did on Lester Bush. He wrote an article, Mormonism and the Negro Doctrine, in 1973. Published in Dialogue, a Journal of Mormon Thought, in which he exploded the long assumption that Joseph Smith had introduced the racial restriction and proved that it was Brigham Young who introduced the racial restriction. And that caused this reckoning and was one of the instigators for the 1978 change. Although, again, as I discussed in a previous video, Brazil was the primary cause, but at least the Lester Bush article provided some foundation. So who could be the next Lester Bush? Now, I could point to a number of scholars who are doing great work now who can help transform. I think of Paul Reeve and his book on religion of a different color, which forced Latter-day Saints to wrestle with the racialization of others in the 19th century. I think Paul Reeves' work, more than nearly anyone else, has forced the church to change its narrative on the racial restrictions origins as not revelation, but actually human. Although that perspective, the church seems to have walked back a little bit in recent years. Maybe I'll talk about that if there's another question. I think of Matt Harris's wonderful book on second-class saints, and also his book on Ezra Taft Benson, showing the origins of Mormon conservatism. Maybe there will be a great work that definitively shows Latter-day Saints that conservatism is not the default position of Latter-day Saints. But I'll give one pitch for a book that I'm discussing in my video on Friday, which is a book authored by Elise Boxer on Mormon settler colonialism, which argues that the church needs to confront its racial foundations, especially in relation to Native Americans. I think that's necessary, confronting this legacy of Lamanite discourse and decoupling that our expectations and the reality. I think that's quite important, and Elise Boxer's work is crucial enough. I hope that can do it. So wonderful question, Cameron, and thank you so much for the tip. That's a super question there, and I really appreciate it. Not a history question, but why is Mexican food in California so much better than in Texas? That's not only not a history question, it's a wrong question. It's built on a false assumption. Tex-Mex is the food that will be served in the Celestial Kingdom along with barbecue. Now, I understand California has great tacos and all of that, but I'm offended at that assumption, and if I had goons, I would escort you out. Aaron, if he's Dallas Oaks, maybe his presidency will end by him waking up and realizing it was all a dream. That speaking of science fiction being at the heart of the Mormon tradition, that's a good example there. We're getting near the end of the questions that I've queued up. So if you haven't asked a question yet, please get in there and ask the next one. All right, so from Russell Van Sistine, where do you see the greatest divergence between how historians and faithful members interpret Joseph Smith, and what might each side be missing about the man himself? So the greatest divergence between how historians and faithful members interpret Joseph Smith. Let me share an anecdote that I think captures this well, at least in my mind. When I was writing Kingdom of Nauvoo, I was dealing with the period in which John C. Bennett, who had a meteoric rise in the church, and then was caught sleeping with several women, claiming that it was part of Joseph Smith's polygamous practice. And of course, historians debate how much John C. Bennett knew and whether it was connected and what was Joseph Smith doing in relation. Anyways, in my book, I wrote that something along the lines of John C. Bennett was appropriating religious rhetoric in order to justify or fulfill his carnal desires. And my editor, my wonderful editor, the legendary editor Bob Weil, he wrote in the comments, "How is this different from Joseph Smith?" And that really hit me hard in writing for a general audience and recognizing these assumptions that are often baked in to our ideas of especially how we frame Joseph Smith, that many Latter-day Saints give Joseph Smith the benefit of the doubt. And so I did a long rant in the form of a video back in August on the LDS Church's new Q&A page on Joseph Smith's character, about how the church has gone to the point where they can acknowledge that Joseph Smith was fallible in theory, just not in practice, right? You see all these arguments that say that Joseph Smith was human. He can make mistakes. However, this was not a mistake. This was divine, yada, yada, yada. And I'd love to see, the continuation of that question to now recognizing that, yes, this was a mistake. He wasn't just fallible in theory, he was fallible in practice. And that might include things like polygamy. So in that divergence that Russell wisely asks about, that divergence is probably most seen in two spots. One, the gold plates, because of course, scholars don't believe there were physical gold plates, where Latter-day Saints did. And maybe I'll get into that later. Go ahead and ask a question if you want me to dig into the diverging interpretation of the gold plates. But on polygamy, It is clear to many non-Mormon scholars, when they look at the evidence, that Joseph Smith invented polygamy as a form of lust fulfillment. Now, there are a few who might soften that, but that's the basic understanding. I mean, that's the argument behind John Turner's biography of Joseph Smith that came out earlier this year. Whereas Latter-day Saints want to wrestle with it. We want to, so that maybe lust was involved, but it can't be all of it. And the famous words of Kathleen Flake that I often quote: there were a lot easier ways to have affairs than to create this complicated eternal theological cosmos of feelings and whatnot. So that there has to be more there. And so to get on to the question of what might each side be missing about the man himself. Well, the most common critique of scholarly writings of Joseph Smith, because they take this naturalistic perspective, and my book, Kingdom Nauvoo, was dinged by this by some, is that when you take that perspective, you can't really explain his appeal, right? After I finished my first draft of Kingdom Nauvoo, I had a colleague read through it. And this colleague was not a Latter-day Saint and read through the volume and is like, why did people follow this guy? I don't see the appeal. And so I think scholars sometimes in humanizing, naturalizing, they don't capture what drove thousands to sacrifice their lives in terms of fundamentally transforming what they were doing to follow someone that they believe to be a prophet. And then on the other end, these faithful accounts that talk about Joseph Smith, I think on the one hand, within a faithful community, those accounts don't capture the wrestling, the complication, the nuances of the experience, that people actually struggled with Joseph Smith saying. And that doesn't really make sense when Joseph Smith is always, a divine leader. And second, outside the faith, you're just not going to convince those who don't accept Joseph Smith as a prophet. And more, you're not able to explain why a group of otherwise peaceful, law-abiding citizens in Illinois decided that their best course for justice was to kill Joseph Smith while held as a state prisoner in the county jail in Carthage. If you're just presenting Joseph Smith as, a divine, infallible leader, then you'll never be able to understand why people wanted to kill him. Other than just giving the lazy solution of where they were inspired by the devil. And so I think that's at least a few points of the greatest divergence on polygamy and what each side might be missing due to result. All right. Awesome Possum asks, going to be in Salt Lake City the first week of December. What are some places to see, things to do that you recommend to learn about Mormon history? The most important thing you need to do is go to Gilgal Gardens and see the Joseph Smith Sphinx. It is the weirdest cultural expression of Mormon worship in the modern church. And it's so insanely odd that you have to go and see for yourself because it is worth it. You also have to go to Red Iguana, but that's just in the food world because their mole is outstanding. Other things to see for church history. The LDS Church History Museum, while of course structured to be faith promoting, is still very interesting, especially after the renovations they've introduced in recent years. And you'll see lots of really cool stuff, including, don't forget to go up to the second floor where they have their Presence of the Church exhibit, and you can see Brigham Young's really cool sunglasses. I'll just leave it at that. So that's really cool. And one final place to see about Mormon history in Salt Lake City, go to the cemetery. The Salt Lake City Cemetery is phenomenal because you see the graves of so many prominent LDS leaders, and you'll just see their names and you'll see how they're commemorated in various ways. And the Salt Lake City Cemetery is one of my favorite places. And one last thing, there's a wonderful book on the houses in the avenues. The avenues are the homes of the northern side of Salt Lake City, leading up on the footsteps of the mountains. And it'll list like who lived in what houses. I love to walk through the Salt Lake City avenues. That's like my dream location because there's such cool houses, so much history packed in there that I really, really like. All right. Michael Ward asks, kids used to perform baptisms for the dead and women used to do ordinances for the dead for men. When did this change and what was the context? Are there other similar changes you know of? So kids used to perform baptisms for the dead. I'm not sure when that changed, but I can tell you when the intergender ordinances were changed. So when Joseph Smith introduced baptisms for the dead in the Nauvoo, everyone just went into the river and was basically baptized for anyone dead that they knew, male or female, whether they were connected or not. Although there was early instruction that you can only be baptized for someone who appeared to you in spirit and said they wanted to be baptized. Suddenly thousands of people claimed that, but then they took that away and they were all baptized. It wasn't until a couple of years later, but still in Nauvoo, that they changed it that men can only be baptized for men and women can only be baptized for women. I'm not sure when kids used to perform baptism, besides the fact that a lot of LDS prophets like Brigham Young and Wilford Woodruff, or at least when they're apostles, they had their children endowed like at the age of 12. In part because they saw this dynastic growth for their family within their church, and also because they believed spiritual power came from those temple rituals, and it was important for them to get it done. That changed. We get a lot of the routinization or organization of temple practices and ages, first in the 1890s and then fundamentally in the 1920s. And the 1920s is probably when the standards, the practices, even the texts of the temple become standardized. In fact, before the 1920s, if you were to go to the Salt Lake Temple and then the Logan Temple, you would experience different endowments or different lectures, different texts. It wasn't until the 1920s that they had the universal texts across all the different decades. And again, if you want to read more of that, Jonathan Stapley's wonderful book, Holiness of the Lord, which I interviewed him about a couple weeks ago, is a great introduction. Could you talk about James Strang? Also, what are your favorite American religion topics that are not related to Mormonism? Two great questions. So James Strang, for those who may not be familiar with the name, he was a convert to Mormonism in the Nauvoo period. He visits Nauvoo and meets with Joseph Smith just a few months before Joseph Smith is dead. And then after Joseph Smith dies, James Strang claims that Joseph Smith had written him a letter that had said that you're supposed to be the successor, and that he was then visited by an angelic Joseph Smith and was ordained. He would eventually dig up his own scriptural records, produce his own book of scripture, have his own witnesses, in many ways recreating a lot of the Joseph Smith story. He was basically performing prophetic mimesis here. And a lot of important Mormons go along with Strang, especially when the alternative was Brigham Young and moving out west. Strang gets several thousand converts right on the eve of the Latter-day Saints moving. And including people like David Whitmer and allegedly Oliver Cowdery, but also several members of Smith's family, and John C. Bennett goes for a ride. He's a fascinating figure. I'm not an expert on the topic. I might read up on it, although I co-authored an article with Robin Jensen, who is a phenomenal Joseph Smith Papers Project editor, who, by the way, is delivering a lecture in the Mormon History Association lecture series, which is a free online series. He's doing a lecture for the MHA series next Thursday at 7 p.m. Mountain Time, so a week from tomorrow, on the documents concerning Nauvoo polygamy, which isn't a topic anyone really cares about, right? No, it's a great topic, and he is one of the top experts on that. So please go to MormonHistoryAssociation.org and you can register for that, for the free online lecture. Anyways, back to Strang. I did co-author an article with Rob Jensen that was published in Journal of Mormon History on a debate between Strangite missionaries and Brighamite missionaries in 1846 that kind of captures these divergent strangs that Brigham Young was trying to introduce a kingdom that's around these salvific kinship networks. And James J. Strang was in many ways a harkening back to Mormonism's pure origins, he would argue. But I'll do a video on him in the future. Go ahead and drink. From worldview connections. Concerning D. Todd Christofferson, are you aware of any reason why people are concerned about his handling of abuse cases? Is there any reason for concern about his dealings there? I don't know. That's a good question. I know the church is dealing a lot with abuse. I could see maybe that because D. Todd Christofferson has a legal background, maybe he was involved in those legal cases. I genuinely don't know. So I would be interested. If anyone knows, feel free to chime in. But that's out of my expertise. All right, next question. Got a question from. Sorry. How do you feel the current church leadership is about the impact of MAGA white Christian nationalism on young LDS generations and the loss of more progressive approaching Zion members? That's a wonderful question. I actually, if you missed it, I did an interview with Matt Harris on his article on white Christian nationalism in white Christian nationalism in Cleon Skousen and Ezra Benson, and how they tried to loop in J. Edgar Hoover in their fight for white Christian nationalism in the mid 20th century, which is a phenomenal article that I strongly recommend. But to your question of how leadership feels about MAGA, I mean, reading the tea leaves from the outside, I think it's very clear that Dallin H. Oaks is not a fan. He has often spoken, as much as Dallin H. Oaks hates progressivism, he is equally uncomfortable with the populism on the right. I mean, he came out and said that Latter-day Saints should accept the results of an election, which seemed to be a direct response to the conspiracy theories that led to the January 6th insurrection. He also, in speaking to BYU in 2020, said that Black Lives Matter is a suitable slogan. So I think LDS leaders in general, and this is reading the tea leaves from the outside, they seem to be worried about the magnification of culture. But, and again, this is another big but, I think they're not anxious to speak out on it because they've recognized how deep-seated that culture has become. And they learned during the COVID crisis that in many of these issues, it's a third rail topic that will cause problems and backlash that they want to avoid. And so I think, A, they're not a fan, but B, I don't think they feel they can do anything about it without a major backlash. All right, a question that Anthony sent me from someone that's probably not showing up on my page. What are your thoughts on why is the First Presidency of the Church now made up of 2 lawyers, attorneys, and 1 business executive? What are they getting ready to do? Why did Dallin Oaks teach people that? I'll take these in turn. So that first one, why is the First Presidency made up of 2 lawyers and attorneys? I think that's just kind of the background that a lot of leaders have come to accept. I mean, gone are the days in the early 20th century that they were choosing people out of academia that were, engaged in theological research. As the church became broader, more global, more bureaucratized, they recognized that a lot of the skills set come from the business background and the legal background. So that funnels into the quorum of the 70 and those leaders, and it's out of those quorums that you usually pick apostles. So I think that's one that as the church became more corporatized and bureaucratized, they're going to choose people with that type of skill set to lead. Now, from a faithful LDS perspective, they would say that God is raising these people to develop those skill sets that will then enable them to lead a global institution. Why did Dallin H. Oaks teach people that research is not the answer? What are your thoughts about the anti-intellectualism in the LDS Church? Talks, conferences have an anti-intellectual vibe. This is one of the great ironies of Dallin H. Oaks' life, something that I talked about in my Oaks video, which is that Oaks was part of the founding editorial board for Dialogue, a Journal of Mormon Thought. But then he left the journal. And one of the reasons was he worried that that type of discourse was leading people astray. And so that's why decades later, Dallin H. Oaks delivers the address called Alternate Voices, in which he denounces those groups, those venues, those ideas that are outside of the correlated message and do not fit this narrative. And perhaps the best language to demonstrate that is he gave an address during that time in which he said, criticism of the brethren is wrong even when that criticism is correct, right? That you shouldn't criticize the brethren, even when the criticism is true. And he justified that position by saying that. Now I'm taking on like an Oaks persona. I promise I won't try to impersonate his voice. That number one. No, he said that if I'm a lawyer and I'm representing someone, I know a lot more about that person in the background than I'm willing to share in the court. This idea that not everything that is true is useful, and I think that perspective reflects this idea that only the things that build into the church's correlated message should be highlighted. That's what's really important. And that kind of does fit into this anti-intellectual trend. Now, importantly, Oaks has softened on that in recent years. He was, as far as I can tell, one of the big supporters of the Joseph Papers Project, which includes what previous generations would have called criticisms of the church. He praised Kathleen Flake's book on the Reed Smoot trial, which includes what previous generations would have considered criticism of the church. So I think there is some progress, but in general, I think that there's a fear that narratives and messages that the church can't control cause confusion, and the best thing to do is to stay on target. Have you looked into the theory that translation used the astrology definition, meaning collect light, influence, intelligence, and that the plates were a homemade book of spirits per the Magus? That's a fascinating theory. I did a video on magic and early Mormonism, and that kind of teases out some of those ideas. I think that that might be going more than what a lot of Latter-day Saints would be comfortable with. But I do think it's clear that, just like I talked with the Book of Abraham, many Latter-day Saints have come to be seeing the Book of Mormon as translated in a way that does not reflect traditional translation. That translation is more a revelation, that if you want to put it in the magic context, that would look more like the astrological definition than the traditional academic definition. And last comment that was coming from Anthony, then I'll get some more in the chat here. What would it take to canonize the family proclamation? I don't want to have that happen, but it seems like there are members of the 12 that wanted to happen. That's another question that I wanted to get to. So I'm really glad you brought that up, whoever asked that one, which is, I think the proclamation would have been canonized by now if it was going to be canonized, especially since we learned that Russell M. Nelson was the primary author behind it. Now, I know there's rumors of a legal team being the primary author, and I think it's clear that at the very least, lawyers had a say in how it was structured. But Russell M. Nelson was the head of the committee that came up with the family proclamation. And so I think that that fact that it hasn't been canonized hints that there are people in LDS circles uncomfortable with the proclamation and pushing back. And we saw this also when Boyd K. Packer, back in 2012, don't quote me on the year, back in 2012 or so, in a general conference address, he referred to the family proclamation as a revelation. And then in the printed version of his remarks, that phrase was taken away. And I think that showed that there is some queasiness at the top level of granting the family proclamation that final canonical status. I think another question to ask related to that is, does that matter? I've gone to the point to where I don't think it matters that the family proclamation is canonized, because it already receives more attention and seems to be granted more authority than much of what's already in the canon. So, for instance, there's an entire gospel doctrine lesson devoted to the family proclamation. There's an entire institute class devoted to the family proclamation. There are entire books of scripture in the LDS canon that don't get that much attention. The family proclamation is quoted ad infinitum in general conferences, a lot more than certain books of scripture. So I think sometimes this dispute of whether the family proclamation will be canonized sidesteps the fact that the family proclamation is already treated with that type of authority. All right, I want to get to the question from Kendra. Thank you so much, Kendra, for your tip going along with the question. Going from missionary to scholar, what issue created the greatest cognitive dissonance for you? And what topics eventually broke your shelf? By the way, thank you for your amazing videos. Thank you so much, Kendra. I appreciate it. Now, I try to avoid a lot of my own personal stuff because I believe my own personal background is the least interesting thing I can talk about. I'm more interested in talking about others. But since you're so kind in asking, I will give a few things. I did talk in a Instagram and TikTok walk and talk today about how the Dick Cheney protest at BYU, which came to mind since Dick Cheney passed away yesterday. When Dick Cheney was announced as the commencement speaker for BYU in April of 2007, I was about a year off my mission at that point, and I had always assumed that all Latter-day Saints were Republicans and that it wasn't even possible to be a Democrat. And due to the student protests that were waged as a response of the Dick Cheney commencement, I was shocked. I was taken back. In fact, I have clear memories of this very faithful young Latter-day Saint student who was also in this philosophy of religion class that I took with David Paulson. Shout out to any of you who took David Paulson's philosophy of religion class. Phenomenal substantive class. And she was the kind of student that in her answers, she would reference the temple. Like that's how devoted she was. And I saw her at these protests, and that shook me because that's one of the first times that I realized that A, you can be a Democrat and a faithful Latter-day Saint, and B, that dissent and protest and constant contestation was a part of the Latter-day Saint tradition, and that really opened my eyes. Another point that caused cognitive dissonance. I started working for the Joseph Smith Papers Project as a research assistant when I was an undergrad. And I was so grateful that I was able to be shepherded through those difficult topics by some of the great scholars of Mormonism, and I think that was able to help lessen the blow with the cognitive dissonance because I had people literally standing next to me or seated next to me who could provide various answers. Now, of course, those answers didn't suit me the long term, but I think it was more the cultural ruptures that came later on. I'll give one more anecdote to answer Kendra's question. And that was the November 5th, 2015 LGBTQ policies. I actually have a video queued up to go on my Instagram and TikTok and Facebook feeds tomorrow morning talking about this. That I remember where I was when I learned of those November 5th, 2015 policies. And I'm sure that's the case for many of you as well. I was teaching at the University of Missouri, but I was in Utah, invited to participate at a panel at Utah Valley University. And I had met with friends at Slab Pizza. I don't know if those of you in Provo near BYU know the phenomenon that Slab is. And it was like, in many ways, it was the best of Mormonism because I was surrounded by my friends eating good food and, engaging important topics. And then we're starting scrolling our phones and we see the news, and that policy was so odious, something beyond what I thought was possible. Now, all of us expected something was coming from the church due to the Obergefell ruling earlier that year, but this went beyond what we thought was possible. And further, seeing other Latter-day Saints defend it, that was quite shocking and in many ways quite consequential for me long term. All right, I have other comments coming in from Anthony. Howdy, Dr. Park. I had reached out to you about the topic of leaders being incapacitated, especially Monson and the 2015 policy. You suggested Prince's book. Do you have any takeaways you want to share? That's a reference to there's a wonderful Mormon Land interview. Mormon Land is a podcast run by the Salt Lake Tribune, Peggy Fletcher Stack, David Noyce, and Tamara Kensley. Phenomenal podcast. It should be in all of your feeds. They're always interviewing the best people, and I'm not just saying that because I've been on their program dozens of times. But they had on Greg Prince, who is a phenomenal historian of modern Mormonism, who is connected to a lot of leaders, so he has these oral histories and inside info. And he made the case that one of the consequences of having the elderly succession structure of the LDS Church, in which you're an apostle until you die, and so if you become president, you remain a president until you die. One of the consequences of is because now modern medicine allows people to live well beyond what they used to, but it cannot assure that you maintain the mental acuity in those later years. So the way that Prince puts it, which I think was great, modern medicine allows people to preserve from the neck down, but not always from the neck up. And that means we've had several moments in which LDS presidents were physically unwell and incapacitated for a large portion of their presidency. Spencer W. Kimball for his last 5 years, Ezra Taft Benson for the last 6 years, Thomas S. Monson for nearly his entire presidency. And Prince notes that in each of those moments, there was a crisis that might have been averted had there been someone fully cognizant in charge. During the Kimball and Benson years, it was Boyd K. Packer going out and trying to excommunicate and interrogate LDS scholars. And then during the Monson years, it was the 2015 November policy, which Prince posits, based on his inside information, which I cannot confirm or verify at all because this is beyond our access, but he claims that Russell M. Nelson pushed that policy that would have otherwise gone through a much longer review process, but because of the physical circumstances of the president, was able to be expedited. And which is why, at the very least, I think it's clear that much of the church was caught off guard. I mean, public affairs, it's been confirmed, did not know it was coming. And you would think something that they knew would have such a major response, they would have had something prepared, which is why D. Todd Christofferson had that rushed and very awkward interview with the church newsroom that evening. So I think those are a few lessons. All right, could you address the issue of the lectures on faith and lecture 5, Godhead seems to be a very different God than the Orthodox? Was this view of God the reason for the historic persecution of the saints? So 2 questions there. Lectures on faith were a series of lectures that seemed primarily written by Sidney Rigdon, but also at the very least approved by Joseph Smith. So I don't want to seem like I'm downplaying Joseph Smith's involvement, because at the very least he approved it. That was included in the original 1835 Doctrine and Covenants. Some have framed it as the lectures on faith were the doctrine and the revelations were the covenants. But as scholars have kind of dug in, those boundaries don't really meet. And they stay in the Doctrine and Covenants all the way until I think the 1921 edition, although don't quote me on that, but it stays for a while and then it's just removed. And importantly, it's removed without like a sustained vote. Like the saints sustained the lectures on faith being added, and then it was removed quietly. And one of the reasons why it's clear it was removed was its teaching of the Godhead did not fit what the church later teaches. Now, there have been some apologetic acrobats to try to explain that here are a lot of that it actually does fit. I don't buy that. I think the LDS Church's doctrine of the Godhead evolves quite substantially, and the lectures on the faith is just one marker in that evolution. To answer the second part of that question is, was this view of God the reason for the historic persecution of the saints? I don't think so. I think that the persecution of the saints was more due to social and political reasons, because there were lots of people in early America who had radical theologies of the Godhead that did not receive the same attention. So I think the issues in Missouri and Kirtland and Nauvoo and Utah were not connected to the theology of the Godhead. I'm going to start answering these quickly because I think we're running out of time, because I want to finish at 90 minutes because I don't want to hog all of your evenings being yelled at by a nerdy guy with bald head and beard. How do you think U.S. and Mormon culture today would be different if Mormons had come to Texas rather than Utah? That's a great question, because when Joseph Smith and the Council of 50 were initially organized in March of 1844, they thought Texas was going to be the place where they might have an outpost. And they started having a secret communication with Sam Houston, who is the governor of Texas. That option was closed off when Texas was annexed by the United States the very next year, which meant why would they leave Illinois? United States would stay in the United States. They wanted to go out to Mexico because they believed Mexico would be more accommodating. It just so happens that while they're marching out to Mexico, America invades Mexico, starts the US-Mexico War, and that territory of Utah becomes part of the United States. What might have been different? I think Mormonism would have been interwoven with slavery even more, because there were some in the Latter-day Saint leadership who saw no conflict with slavery. Orson Hyde, who is an apostle, writes this sobering letter that I don't see enough people referencing. In 1844, he writes this letter to the church proposing that, hey, why don't we start a colony? Why don't we start a colony in Texas so that all our converts from the South who practice slavery can go to our Texas colony? We can have our own church-owned plantations, and the money raised from those slave plantations would finally get us the funds necessary to complete the Nauvoo Temple. right? Just think about that for a moment. A proposal that the Nauvoo temple could be built with funds created by a slave plantation in Texas. And that was proposed by the Apostle Orson Hyde. So I think one difference is I think Mormonism would have become even more interwoven with slavery than they were in Utah. Now, of course, Mormons were interwoven with slavery in Utah, as Paul Reeve and LeJean Cruth and Christopher Rich's phenomenal recent book, This Abominable Slavery, makes clear. Have there been any counselors or prophets that have shown a level of independent thought not common with this calling? By that, I mean to disagree with each other policy publicly. Yes, Hugh B. Brown. Hugh B. Brown was a First Presidency counselor in the 1960s who publicly and vehemently disagreed with the conservatism being pushed by apostles like Ezra Taft Benson. And at some points, he'd do it indirectly, like he would challenge an idea without naming Ezra Taft Benson, but Benson knew he was talking about him because he'd immediately be in David O. McKay's office, the president, the next day saying, "Why is Hugh B. Brown talking about me?" And Hugh B. Brown tried to introduce a number of revisions and changes to the church, including ordaining Black men to at least the Aaronic priesthood, that he nearly succeeded before it was squashed by Harold B. Lee and other leaders. Matt Harris, who wrote the phenomenal Second Class Saints book, as well as the book on Ezra Benson, is currently working on a biography of Hugh B. Brown that's going to be phenomenal. But you can go check out his interview with Mormon Land from a few months ago. I think it was back in June, where he gave some early insights onto Hugh B. Brown. So he's a counselor that really cut against the grain. And then when Joseph Fielding Smith became president, Hugh B. Brown was dropped from the First Presidency, which is similar to another counselor in recent years who was seen as maybe out of step with the church's conservative direction. Related to podcasts, what are your top 5 Mormon-related podcasts? I've mentioned Salt Lake Tribune's Mormon Land podcast, which I can't emphasize enough is phenomenal. Sunstone Mormon History podcast with Brian Buchanan and Lindsay Hansen Park is a phenomenal deep dive that they're moving chronologically. And I think they're on part like 45 on the Utah War by this point. So that's great. Saints and Scholars, the podcast by the University of Virginia Mormon Studies program, currently hosted by Nicholas Schrum. They interview the latest scholarship in Mormon history. So I think that's phenomenal. I'll also give a shout out to Radio West, the KUER NPR program in Salt Lake City. They don't do Mormon history a lot. Like, I think they say their goal is to have only one of every 20 episodes on Mormonism, although I think they do more than that in general. And they're always the best content. One last Mormon history. I mean, you can't go wrong with the classics of the Mormon Stories interviews or Seer Stones. Angels and Seer Stones by Christopher Blythe and Christine Blythe is another phenomenal discussion. And I think they've been meaning to come out with a new season. And if they haven't yet, people should shame them until they do. Is there any data to suggest that the Book of Mormon translation took longer than 60 to 90 days? So that's a common apologetic argument, that we only have 60 to 90 days in which Joseph Smith produced the Book of Mormon. I don't think there's any evidence that the text from the Book of Mormon was created outside of that 90-day period. But as William Davis outlined in his book, Visions in a Seer Stone, that does not mean that Joseph Smith was not thinking about or tinkering with ideas in the Book of Mormon well before that. And he has this genius interpretation of these heads and oral culture, and Joseph Smith performing the Book of Mormon before writing it down. And so, no, I don't think there's evidence that shows that the text of the Book of Mormon was produced outside of that 60, 90 days. But I think there are persuasive arguments to show that the production of the Book of Mormon needs to be elongated out. Do you think there'll be an exit movement in the LDS Church akin to the ACNA and the Episcopal Church or the United Methodist Church and renewal Mormon fundamentalism, or at least Mormon offshoots? I think it's fair to say that the church is worried about such a schism. I think it's clear they recognized in recent years that a large percentage of their American membership has bought into this conservative culture, and they're afraid not to disrupt that. Now, that hasn't stopped some moving far enough to the right, and I think that's where you get the Denver Snuffer breakoffs. You see the Bundys breakoffs. The fact that you have people like Tim Ballard or the person who did the Oath movie come out and feel confident enough to critique church leaders from the right shows that there's a bit of a Overton's window that's allowing rightward saints to move that direction. Whether that results in a schism, I don't know, but I do think there's an anxiety there. Now that the church is very corporate, do you see any more apostles, Fielding Smith McConkie, more interested in shaping doctrine and theology? Will there be another answers to gospel questions? I don't see it. I don't see it. I don't think we have church leaders who see themselves as those types of doctrinaires and theologians, in large part because both the bureaucratic structure, which leads a certain type of leaders, the lawyers, the businessmen, the managers, but also because of correlation. I think correlation is the primary reason why LDS leaders believe the doctrine is settled, and they're more working with those settlement, which is why I think, Sunday school lessons are now just based on general conference talks, because it's not a theological, doctrinally investigative exploration. It's more of a correlated doctrine. What is the intersection between the mound builder's manifest destiny and Joseph Smith's knowledge of the Bible? I feel like he is often portrayed as practically illiterate. That's another great question that, again, I'm going to reference William Davis's recent book, as well as an article he published in Dialogue of Journal of Mormon Thought about Joseph Smith's level of education. I think it's very clear that Joseph Smith and those around him were fascinated with the ancient inhabitants of the New World and tried to provide background for them. There were many, including, prominent figures like Thomas Jefferson, who were speculating on the origins of the American indigenous inhabitants, to the point of speculating of maybe they're one of the lost tribes of Israel. So I think it's clear that this fascination with mound builders cultivated a sense of fascination or a obsession on Joseph's part. And that's the context in which the Book of Mormon was at the very least understood, or if you want to take a natural list take, that was in which it was cultivated. What doctrines or issues do you foresee Elder Bednar addressing when he becomes president? How is he different from current leadership? Man, we are running out of time. I'm going to try to I'm going to do very quick responses here. Bednar, I think Bednar is very conservative, but in a very different way than, say, Dallin H. I think Bednar's conservatism is more in the form of fundamentalism, in which you see these social issues and legal matters that Oaks see as so important as a distraction from the doctrines of the church. I think Bednar would see himself as apolitical, but that apolitical status is something that is much more retrenched. So while Dallin H. Oaks's theology is much more intellectual, so to speak, I think Bednar's is much more culturally retrenched. How will the likely ahistoricity of the Book of Mormon affect Mormonism in the coming years? I don't see how it's changing, because Latter-day Saints have been dealing with these historicity issues all the way back to in the 1920s, with where the New Age critiques of the Book of Mormon, drawing from anthropology and linguistics and history rather than just evangelical anti-Mormonism, have forced the LDS Church to confront that, and they haven't backed down. Now, I think you might see some responses, like I think it was Russell Nelson a few years ago, who said the Book of Mormon shouldn't be read as a historical text, which some said, oh my gosh, does that mean he's not saying it's not historical? He's not. He's just saying it should not be read as a textbook. It should be read as a spiritual guide. And for several decades now, we have had a growing number of Latter-day Saints positing the Book of Mormon in what Blake Ostler in the 1980s called an expansion theory, that there might have been some core historicity there, but then is expanded to match Joseph Smith's day. Let's see. I think I got all the ones that, or let's see. How do you think people like Joseph White Musser and the rise of Mormon fundamentalism influence modern church? Those of you who have listened to me before, it's a pet topic of mine. which is, I think modern Mormonism, much of it is in response to the fundamentalist movement in trying to demonstrate their interpretation of the faith that distance themselves from the fundamentalists. So you can't understand Mormon fundamentalism without mainstream LDS Church, and you can't understand the LDS Church without recognizing the influence of fundamentalism. Is there a leg to stand on for those that deny Joe Smith used Seer Stones to translate the Book of Mormon? I don't think so. I think the historical record is clear and plentiful that the Seer Stones were the primary method used to translate the Book of Mormon. I'm going to try to get these last questions in the thread here. Perhaps brisket and barbecue would take the cultural place of green jello and funeral potatoes. Yes, that would have been a great result of the Mormons going to Texas. What would the official epistemology be to determine LDS doctrine? How does it evolve over time? Daniel is right in the comments that is a great question and one deserving its own video. So I'm not going to do justice here. Although I will say that there are diversity in that LDS epistemology over the years, and we're seeing a move more toward a fundamentalist bent today. And then finally, last question from Evan Beal. What is the role of Mary in LDS theology or worship? I haven't been able to find much on this. The answer is I haven't seen anything. Many Latter-day Saints would classify that as too Catholic, something outside the realm of Latter-day Saint worship. And that would be how they would define their boundaries as different from other Christian traditions. They would say that the role of Mary is something outside our bounds. And especially they would probably interpret it in a traditional gender sphere. To reaffirm the boundaries of motherhood in Mary rather than a divine prophetess that you might see in other traditions. Whew. I think that's it. Thank you, all of you, for bearing with me. I think we had a couple hundred different people filter in and out over the last 95 minutes. I'm definitely going to go take a throat lozenge and drink a bit because I'm a bit dead here. But I really do appreciate the feedback. I appreciate the engagement. If you haven't yet, please make sure you're subscribed to my channel. We're nearing that 10,000 subscriber mark, which I never thought possible. And I'm thrilled it's there. And you all know how I finish the video. History has never been more relevant than the present. These discussions are difficult, but they are important. And I'm so grateful to be able to engage all of this with you and hopefully in videos going forward. So with all of that, have a good night, everyone.